Hi, my name is Peter Gwin, and I'm a writer for National Geographic. For the last 3 years, photographer Marcus Bleasdale and I have been reporting from the Central African Republic, supported in part by a grant from the Pulitzer Center. In recent years, the Central African Republic has posed one of the most vexing questions in Africa. How does a country roughly the size of France, with a small population and a wealth of natural resources, become a failed state? How does a country that once was seen as a haven for refugees from other war-torn countries suddenly itself become a killing ground? We embarked on this project soon after a rebellion had toppled the government of President Francois Bozize in 2013, and the country was engulfed in chaos. But the seeds for this crisis have been sown over the course of many years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Central African Republic and how the crisis unfolded, and show you some photos and videos from our reporting. The Central African Republic is a landlocked country located at the heart of the continent, surrounded by Cameroon, Chad, Sudan, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's about the same size as France, and vast swaths of the country are covered in dense bush and are uninhabited. For the first half of the 20th century, it was a French colony until it was led to independence in 1959 by Barthélemy Boganda, a Roman Catholic priest. Just before Boganda was to take office as president, he was killed in a suspicious plane crash. To this day, Boganda remains a deeply revered figure in the Central African Republic, and many Central Africans believe his death was orchestrated by French interests. The French government has always denied any role in Boganda's death. Since independence, France has continued to wield much influence over the Central African Republic's internal affairs, and the country has seen a succession of leaders toppled by coups d'etat. But despite such political turmoil, it never previously endured widespread violence or suffered major bloodshed. The Central African Republic has many valuable resources, including large amounts of timber and diamonds, as well as gold, uranium, and potential oil reserves. But it is also one of Africa's least developed countries, according to the United Nations. It especially lacks transportation infrastructure with no railroad and has the fewest paved roads per square kilometer of any country in the world. The recent conflict began in 2012. Muslims make up only about 15% of Central African Republic's population, but they form a decided majority among the herding communities of the country's far northeast. This is also the least developed region, with the fewest schools and medical clinics and the worst roads. Militant groups there helped Bozize seize power in a coup in 2003 and felt he had betrayed them by not sharing power with them and never fulfilling his promises to improve their lives. Several armed groups banded together, calling themselves the Seleka, which means coalition in the local Sango language. Joined by mercenaries from Chad and Sudan, they fought their way across the country to the capital Bangui. Along the way, they looted and burned villages and killed many people as they went, sending men, women, and children fleeing into the bush. The Seleka routed the National Army and went on to brutally rule the country for 9 months. During this time, their fighters targeted Christian communities for special abuse and violence, including rapes and public lynchings. In response, groups across the country, composed mostly of Christians and animists, formed local militias known as the Anti-Balaka to fight the Seleka. They also committed numerous atrocities against innocent Muslim civilians who had nothing to do with the Seleka. Eventually, the French, the EU, and the UN sent in peacekeeping troops, and much of the violence was quelled, but not before more than 1 million people had been displaced from their homes and thousands had died. Communities across the country that once were mixed with Muslims and Christians, who for generations had lived in peace and often intermarried, were ethnically cleansed. Under pressure from the international community, the Seleka officially disbanded. Its former leaders and their militia retreated to their strongholds northeast of Bangui. Today, they still control large parts of the country. As part of our reporting, Marcus and I traveled to one of these areas. Former Seleka General Ali Darassa, a shadowy figure who also fought in rebellions against the Chadian government, now heads a faction called the Union for Peace in the Central African Republic, known as the UPC. He has held control of Bambari, one of Central African Republic's most important towns, and its surrounding region since the Seleka disbanded 3 years ago. Located in the center of the country, Bambari, for all practical purposes, represents the divide between areas controlled by the Anti-Balaka fighters and former Seleka forces. During our time in Bambari and on a subsequent trip last summer, I tried to interview Darassa several times. His men always made excuses for why he wasn't available, but they allowed us to move freely around their territory. As we traveled around the town and the surrounding area interviewing locals, we found that Darassa's fighters were collecting a $50 tax on every head of cattle out of the hundreds bound for Bangui markets each week. They also demanded protection money from shop owners, set up checkpoints to collect tolls from passing vehicles, including ours, and charged tariffs on the value of goods carried by traders. But the crown jewel in Darassa's portfolio was a gold mine about 40 miles outside of town. Before the crisis, a Canadian company had begun prospecting at the site, but when the violence erupted, the company left, along with dozens of other foreign firms that had been exploring for oil, harvesting timber, working on roads and dams. When the Canadians left, locals who knew about the site began digging for the gold by hand. Some 300 men and boys desperate for money have come from all over Central African Republic to work here. Their ranks include both Muslims and Christians. No one talks about religion or politics here, one worker told me. We are all here for the same thing. Our families need to eat. The workers use only their shovels and backs to excavate tons of earth each day in order to reach the gravel that contains the gold. The families of the diggers, including women and children, help rinse and sift the gravel to reveal the flecks and nuggets of gold, all under the watchful eyes of Darassa's men, who collect upwards of 6% of each man's take. They claim it is their payment for providing security. A foreman at the mine told me that the mine generates some $4 million a year. If true, Darassa has likely made well more than $1 million from the mine and his other extortions during his time in control. As one local official told me privately, that much money can buy many weapons and many men and much influence out here. Earlier this year, Darassa and his fighters were chased out of the Bambari region, but not by UN peacekeepers. Rather, it was his former Seleka comrades who had banded together to oust him and take over his wealth. Recent reports from the area say diggers continue to work the gold mine, but now they have new masters to pay.